Welcome to Wisconsin in Focus. I'm JD Davidson. It's not unusual for school districts in Wisconsin to put tax measures on the ballot, either during a primary or general election. What is unusual is the amount of those issues that failed earlier this month. Joining us today is Ben Yount, Wisconsin contributor for the Center Square. Ben, what percentage of potential tax hikes were turned away by voters, and what does that look like from a historical perspective?
Voters, for the most part, in both the February primary and this month's spring election, for the most part, they said yes to local school tax questions. A new report's out from the Wisconsin Policy Forum that tracks these votes over years, and the Policy Forum says just over 60%, 60.2%, if you're keeping the scorecard at home, of the spring tax increases were approved. That means a little under 40% failed. And historically, this is a low number. You had a high back 2018 of about 89%. The low was 2002, where just 35% of school tax questions were approved. And this is one of these sort of statistics that, while it is lower than in the past, 60% is still most. And when you take a look at just how much these tax increases are worth, $1 billion, that's an awful lot of money. So while historically in the big picture, more of these tax questions failed, it's still an awful lot of money and an awful lot of schools, 60 something out of 100 that put a tax question on the ballot saw that tax question pass.
You know, I do find this interesting, though. I saw a report last week out of Ohio, and I don't want to call this a national trend, and I'm not sure I'm willing to put the effort in to find out if it's a national trend or not. But it was almost the exact same report that came out of Ohio from their primary election in March. It was the lowest number since 2010, possibly a little earlier. And it was the numbers were eerily similar. It's usually an 85%, 85 to 88% pass rate. This year it was down in the 60s. In Ohio, they have renewal levies as well. So you've been paying the same tax for 30 years, but every 20 years or so they have to come back to renew it. Most of those, 98% pass all the time until this year. That number dipped to 80. Yeah, that's still a big figure. Yeah, the tax money is still a lot, but I can't help but find it interesting that we've got two Midwestern states, similar Midwestern states, that all of a sudden this year, that number takes a pretty significant dip.
I have always said that three local governments doing the same thing, library cuts, or we had to lay off the people who mow the lawn at the parks, or we're going to raise taxes for sewers. Three locals makes a statewide story. 4 states makes a national trend. And I wouldn't doubt that this is a story you could write in almost any state where schools go to taxpayers and more taxpayers are saying, maybe not. The Policy Forum report actually talks about this, and they talk about why there were, again, relatively few tax questions that passed. And the quote we grabbed for the story, across ballots from February and April, 66% of all referendum questions asked voters to raise property taxes to support school district operations. This represents the highest share of operating referenda since at least 2000. Many times when school districts go to voters, it's for a new school. It's for a new football field. We're gonna add turf and we're gonna replace the grass and go Tigers. Capital is the word that we always use. But this year, again, 2/3 were just for day-to-day operations to pay teachers more. Inflation is the big driver, right? The school districts MPS made Milwaukee Public Schools, when they were selling their largest in the state $252 million a year tax increase. They were telling voters, look, we can't keep up with the cost of inflation. We've got to pay our teachers more so they can keep up with the cost of inflation. And the reality of that is voters turn around and say, well, wait, I'm paying more because of the cost of inflation. I can't keep up here, and you want more of my money. And so the Policy Forum report really leaves out there the open question of, is it the financial struggle of voters? And this takes an even more interesting turn. And I think we talked about this during the last podcast when we were talking about the passage of Milwaukee's referendum. When you take a look at who voted for that tax increase in Milwaukee, it was generally older, more affluent white voters, many of whom who don't have kids in Milwaukee public schools. The people who voted no, poorer, more minority voters who do have children in Milwaukee public schools. And that gets to an interesting idea of, well, I can afford this tax increase and well, I think we should support this school system and I don't see anything wrong with it. So I'm going to vote yes for a tax increase, where you have MPS parents who are like, wait, man, I can't afford the hundreds of dollars more that I'm going to pay in property taxes or rent. And besides, MPS isn't doing that great of a job. I think maybe I'm going to say no. And so, yeah, this is an interesting question, is why so many of these failed. It really could be, to quote, the 1992 Bill Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid.
Going back to the report that I saw about Ohio, very similar reasons were given for the failure. One was inflation. Obviously, that's a simple one. The second of the three reasons was higher property appraisals, which I think we see across the country. People get a little scared about that. They don't realize that if your appraisal goes up 35%, that doesn't mean that your taxes go up 35%. But when you have an election this close to an appraisal, it's hard not to think that way if you're a voter. Here's the interesting thing the most interesting thing that I saw. Both the primary in Wisconsin, in presidential primary in Wisconsin and Ohio, there wasn't one. More Democratic people stayed away because in Ohio, there was no Democrat issue at all on the ballot. They tend to vote for school levies. More Republican voters showed up because there was a big race in Ohio for the U.S. Senate. They tend to vote against school levies. More school levies failed. I thought all three of those things were interesting and kind of, again, brings that correlation between two similar Midwestern states.
Yeah. Again, I think that this is the kind of thing that government is real when it comes to schools and cops and snowplows. And, while people are aware of what's going on at their state capital, it really does become personal when it's the school or it's my house, my property taxes. And yeah, there are lots of different, people who no longer have kids in the district or, districts with really good public schools. People tend to support their schools. They may not want more money for that school. I don't think Milwaukee public schools should get a tax increase, but I'm going to vote for my school to get a tax increase. Again, people really love their school, their kids' teachers, their school district, but they're suspect of others. This is one of these ones. And thank God for these white paper guys who will spend 6 months diving into this. And we only have to sort of read the report, make a phone call and catch up and be like, hey, great story. Thanks. Appreciate it, guy. And we're off to the next thing.
Absolutely. Well, there'll be more of these issues coming down the road, I'm sure. Ben, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.